Welcome, Mark, to the Customer Experience Exchange for Financial Services. Thank you for joining us today. Now, what are the main challenges facing the financial services industry right now?
I think the first main challenge, and I suppose the predominant theme, is that we now live in the digital age, and I suppose that affects banks in two ways. So the first would be that from a customer perspective, we as banking customers demand to be connected and be able to bank 24/7, whenever we are, wherever we are. So how that impacts then the traditional banking system of being able to go into a retail bank within office hours, that's just not good enough from a customer perspective. I want to be able to, and I demand to be able to get connected and bank in the same way that I demand to be connected and socialise and interact primarily through my smartphone all the time. And then I think from a banking perspective, because of the digital age, that's lending itself to breaking down geographical boundaries. And so there's much more increased competitions for banks now because of it being easier for non-traditional banks to come in and compete as an online bank, for example. And then also I think when you bring in the new General Data Protection Regulation, the revised Payment Service Directive, banks now must share and be in a position to share their data much more easily than would have traditionally been the case. And as a result, that again lends itself to just increased competition and having non-traditional banks or non-traditional companies compete in the banking space.
And how's technology basically helping the leaders of these banks overcome these challenges?
I think it's the bank that is best equipped and is most agile to adapt to this customer-centric mindset. So if we take what is the customer-centric mindset, as I've already alluded, it's very much a mobile phone-centric mindset of a customer that wants to be able to interact with colleagues, with friends, with family using their smartphone. And they are also then saying, I want that experience to be mirrored in the way that I interact with my bank too. So that brings in a lot of different media, such as social media. And I think it's the banks that are best equipped to firstly know the channel that me as the customer wants to interact with a bank and how best to communicate with me. That they're in the best position, I think, to succeed and adapt. And then secondly, to bring all of this data and bring it into a seamless experience from a customer's perspective, so that multiple channels in which I interact with the bank are talking to each other, so that effectively, to use the analogy, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, which is traditionally difficult because banks are just vast ecosystems and they have so much customer data. But the challenge, and the ones that are doing best at succeeding, and to answer your question, are those that are able to collate this data and deliver a more seamless, integrated experience to customers.
So what kind of behaviours in consumers actually point to the need for investment in digital communication?
I suppose it's worth drilling into a specific medium. So if we take over-the-top social media applications, so peer-to-peer messaging applications such as WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, they're hugely popular, not just amongst millennials, but also more and more so with older age groups then as well. So if that's the way that customers or consumers are interacting with each other, should banks expect any differently when it's how banks interact with customers? So it's how best to bring these new channels or perceived new channels into play from an enterprise perspective. So it's not inconceivable for me to receive notifications from a bank via Facebook Messenger, or indeed in the future via WhatsApp. And again, the banks that are earliest to adopt that technology are likely to get increased customers that are, and typically banking is one where there's huge inertia and very little churn. And I think this is an opportunity where you will see people move banks to the ones that they feel are getting that little bit more of a relationship with their bank.
Do you not feel that in terms of the social and digital, although there's all these opportunities and challenges, but in terms of banks communicating with their consumers in such a social way, do you think the consumer's ready for that?
No, not everybody, not every consumer is going to be ready for that. But again, I think it's about planning for the future. And one of the insights from this morning is that in a couple of years, 75% of banking customers will be in the so-called millennial generation. And again, how do millennials communicate today? They're using their smartphone. What are they using on their smartphone? They're using social media. They're using Snapchat, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc. Not to discount SMS as well, as still, in fact, from an enterprise perspective, SMS is arguably stronger now than it has ever been. Because of the open rates, when people get text messages, they're inclined to open them. So back to your question, I think the banks that adopt this new technology, consumers will be slow to react, and they'll be somewhat guarded, because this is my space, this is the way I interact with my friends. But then I think so long as the communication is relevant, and relevant can be somewhat of an incentive, or it could be a timely piece of communication. So, for example, in a banking perspective, a nice gentle reminder that, you know, it would be good to top up my current account if I want my direct debits to go through, so there are no account surprises on my part, on the part of the customer. That would be something that would be very welcome. So why should that be delivered in a mechanism that I'm unlikely to read? So the traditional letter that just stays unopened in the post, whereas if it comes through in WhatsApp, you know, I think customers will stand up and take notice and say, yeah, that's, I appreciate that they have taken the time to find the relevant channel for me, and then use that information to send me the communication that I need.
So how real is the threat to banks to actually losing their customers to competitors? Isn't churn actually quite low?
There is still considerable inertia from a customer perspective amongst traditional banks, but again, pointing to our earlier conversation, there is more and more competitor banks coming into the market, non-traditional banks, or financial service companies targeting one particular product. So targeting loans, or targeting credit cards, or targeting savings accounts. That's all they do, and that's bringing huge competition and really focusing, making traditional banks stand up and take notice. And if they want that inertia to remain, then they need to enhance the customer experience, because I think customers will go, actually, I can see the clear benefits of why I should have my savings account with this particular company, as opposed to keeping it all within the traditional bank, which I suppose would have been that old school mindset.
Okay, so if you had to get your crystal ball out, what will the CX function look like, especially within financial services, in 2 years' time?
I think AI, artificial intelligence, I think will play a role where a lot of the interaction that I have with my bank will be automated, and will present itself as if there is human interaction when in fact there isn't. I think, you know, I could be having an online web chat with my bank, asking questions such as, can you tell me what my most up-to-date account balance is? And I'll get that information delivered to me on the screen, thinking it's from a particular agent when in fact it's all done artificially. So I think that is certainly short term, that's likely to appear in the future. I think that up until now, when you hear of what we perceive as new entrants into the banking sector, you know, a Spanish bank such as Santander coming into the UK, you think that's a Spanish bank now coming into the UK. Whereas I think in 2 years' time, there will be customers in the UK that will bank directly with Santander, regardless of whether they have a presence in the UK. And I think there'll be a much more globalization in the banking sector in 2 years' time, owing to the revised Payment Service Directive, aka PSD2, and the General Data Protection Regulation that's coming into place as well.
Do you feel like, you know, the impact of Brexit will have any impact on not the banking as a whole, but customer experience, especially with banks like Santander entering the UK space and the different regulations and what's happening now in Europe, do you think that the political impact will consumers basically feel that, or do you think it will be plain sailing for banks?
I think it's too soon to say, to be honest. I think it could, and yet again it might not. It all depends on the famous deal that's yet to be negotiated. So, for example, I think if EU regulation needs to be followed in the banking context, then yes, I think it will have an impact. If it's EEA regulation, which I believe isn't going to be impacted, regardless of the deal that's done as part of Brexit, then I don't think that it will have much of an impact at all. But so honestly, at this stage, I think it's too soon to say.
Thank you once again, Mark, for joining us, and thank you for sharing your insight with us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Tanya.